Thanks for tuning in to Cheating Confessions. Don't miss the jaw-dropping conclusion. Jacob stood by the door, his suitcase already packed. He turned to me with that same expression I knew all too well. Serious, a bit nervous, but with a hint of anticipation, as if he was about to propose something incredibly important. We had been married for 12 years and I could read his face like an open book. Still, his words caught me by surprise. Sophia, he began cautiously as if testing the waters, I'd like you to come with me to Chicago. I froze. Chicago, the city I had always wanted to visit but never thought I'd have the chance to see anytime soon. The thought swirled in my head like a butterfly caught in a web. Chicago, with its skyscrapers, rich history, and vibrant neighborhoods, seemed like a place where one could forget everything and start anew. But this trip wasn't about us, not about my dreams. It was another business trip for Jacob, another important meeting. I knew he was inviting me more out of a sense of duty than a genuine desire to spend time with me. A wave of mild irritation, almost resentment, washed over me. Jacob had always been driven, perpetually occupied with his projects, his career. His world was full of goals and ambitions, and I admired him for that. But lately, I felt an increasing distance between us, as if I was standing on the shore while he sailed further and further out to sea, carried away by his endless pursuits. I don't know, Jacob, I said, feeling my voice grow faint, as if I were losing confidence in my own words. Why not? He looked at me with a touch of disappointment, but his gaze remained soft. It will only be for a few days. I thought you'd want to see Chicago. I sighed, trying to gather my thoughts. Of course, I wanted to see Chicago, but not like this. I didn't want to be just a companion at his important event, as if I were a decorative piece in his life. I longed for a real trip where we could be ourselves, far away from his endless meetings and phone calls. It's not the best time, I finally said. I need to sort out some things here. That was a lie. Deep down, I knew it wasn't about the things I needed to do, it was about us, the distance between us that I had been feeling more acutely lately. Jacob looked at me closely, as if trying to read my mind, but I tried to maintain my composure. All right, he finally smiled, but the smile was tense. I understand. I nodded, feeling something pulling me down like a stone at the bottom of a river. He turned to the door and I watched him leave, feeling a slight relief mixed with a sense of loss, as if I had let go of something important. Jacob left, and I was left alone with my thoughts and a growing sense of emptiness. Left alone, I felt the walls of our house begin to close in on me. For the first time in a long while, I felt a pang of anxiety, something warm and bitter inside. Jacob had left, and it felt as though something important had left with him, as if a tiny crack in our marriage had begun to slowly but inevitably widen. I looked out the window and saw my reflection, a woman of 42, tired, a bit lost, but still alive inside. I saw in her eyes a longing for something that seemed long forgotten, and at that moment, I realized I needed to find myself again before I completely lost something important in this mundane routine. That was when I decided to stay, and this decision would become the beginning of changes I could not yet foresee. The evening slowly descended upon Philadelphia, flooding the streets with a soft golden light. I sat in the kitchen, watching the long shadows cast by the trees, hearing distant voices drifting through the open window. Jacob had left only a few hours ago, but it already felt like several days had passed. The house, without him, suddenly felt strange, unfamiliar. I reached for my phone, and without knowing why, I began scrolling through photos, our pictures together, holidays, trips, happy faces. Moments that once seemed so significant now were just memories. Something inside me stirred, like stale air rising from an old trunk, a feeling I wanted to escape from. I put the phone down and went to the kitchen, deciding to make myself some tea, but even this simple action seemed somehow empty, pointless. I poured water into a cup and suddenly heard my phone vibrate. My heart tightened. For a moment, I thought it was Jacob, but when I looked at the screen, it was my best friend, Karen's name. Sophia, hi. Her voice sounded lively as always, a bit sparkling. I was thinking about you. How are you? Everything's fine, Karen, I replied, trying to put some confidence in my voice. And you? Great, she paused, and I sensed she was carefully listening to my tone. Do you want to meet tonight? There's a place I'd like to take you to. Tonight? I asked, uncertain about what I really wanted. Inside me, two desires wrestled: to hide under a blanket and forget everything, or to run out of the house, to escape this suffocating emptiness. Yes, tonight, she insisted. You need to get out of the house, Sophia. Please don't say no. You look like you could use some fresh air. Her words struck a chord with me. Karen always knew how to pull me out of my cocoon. I sighed, and after a few seconds of thought replied, All right, let's do it. Where do you want to go? To a literary club downtown called Verse and Vibe. They're having a poetry reading tonight. It's something different, and I think you'll like it. I rolled my eyes. A poetry reading sounded like the last place I wanted to be, but maybe that was exactly what I needed. Something new, something I couldn't predict. Fine, I relented. When and where do we meet? In an hour, at my place. I'll pick you up, Karen said with clear relief in her voice. You won't regret it, I promise. I hung up and felt my heart start to beat faster. It was just an evening at a club, but at that moment it felt like I had agreed to something much bigger. I paced around the room, wondering what to wear and whether I was too tired for such adventures. When I reached Karen's house, she was already waiting outside, smiling. We got into her car and drove to the city centre. I noticed how her eyes sparkled and how the energy around her was almost contagious. She was talking about a new poem she had read recently, but I couldn't focus on her words. My gaze wandered among the streetlights, and I suddenly felt myself slowly thawing, like a piece of ice melting under the sun's rays. The club was cozy, with soft lighting and quiet voices filling the space. There was a special atmosphere here, as if the whole world had slowed down, leaving only poetry and thoughts hanging in the air. Karen immediately led me inside, found a comfortable spot on a soft sofa, and offered me a cup of tea. And then I saw him. Daniel. He was standing by the bar, chatting with one of the guests, his face lit up by a smile and his eyes sparkling in the soft light of the lamps. Karen, noticing my gaze, smiled and said, That's the owner of this place. I've known him for many years. Let me introduce you. I wanted to object, but Karen was already leading me to him, and suddenly my heart began to race. As we got closer, he turned toward us and his gaze stopped on me. A genuine smile appeared on his face and his eyes glowed with something special. Karen, he said cheerfully, and then turned to me. And who do we have here? This is my friend, Sophia, Karen introduced me. Sophia, this is Daniel. Nice to meet you, Sophia, he said, extending his hand. When our hands touched, I felt a slight shiver run through my body. This moment was unexpected, and I couldn't explain why. His eyes looked directly into mine, and in that gaze, there was something more than just a greeting. I felt the world around us narrow slightly, and for a moment, I forgot everything that was happening around me. Nice to meet you, Daniel, I replied, trying to stay calm, but my heart was still beating faster than usual. I didn't know then that this evening would change everything. The evening at the club went on, and I found myself becoming more immersed in this unusual yet captivating atmosphere. People around us were reading poems, sharing their thoughts and feelings. I hung on to every word, but my gaze kept drifting back to Daniel, who occasionally glanced at me from across the room. I felt his presence filling the space with a special energy that I couldn't ignore. Karen, noticing my confusion, smiled from her corner, as if she knew something I didn't. When the evening was coming to an end, Daniel approached us with 2 cups of coffee. His smile was gentle, but his gaze remained just as intense. Did you enjoy it? He asked, looking directly at me. Yes, it was interesting, I replied, trying to find the right word. My uncertainty was clearly reflected in my voice. "I'm glad," he said, and glancing at Karen, he added, "I think your friend could use some fresh air. Let's go. I'll show you something." Karen nodded with such confidence that I didn't have a chance to protest. Daniel took my hand, and we stepped out of the club. It was cool outside, the air thick with the scent of rain and freshness. We walked through the narrow streets of Philadelphia, and he told me about his love for the city, the places that had always inspired him. At one point, we stopped in front of a small coffee shop named Brew and Bloom, where, according to him, they made the best coffee in the city. "This is where it all began for me," he said, smiling. "I opened this coffee shop back when I was just starting out. Poets, artists, musicians, they would all come here. There was something magical about it." I smiled, noticing how his eyes lit up when he talked about this place. We went inside, and Daniel, who seemed to know everyone working there, ordered 2 cappuccinos. When the coffee was brought to us, he looked at me as if trying to read my thoughts. "Sophia," he began with an unexpectedly soft voice, "you look like someone who hasn't found time for herself in a long time. Am I right?" That question caught me off guard. His eyes seemed too attentive, too deeply penetrating my thoughts. I felt the defenses I usually kept up around strangers begin to crumble. "Maybe," I admitted, lowering my gaze to my cup. "Sometimes it feels like life is passing me by." He leaned closer to me, his face so near that I could feel his breath on my skin. "I feel the same way," he whispered, his voice sounding like he had known me all his life. "But you know what's interesting? Sometimes it only takes a single moment to change everything." I raised my eyes and met his gaze, filled with warmth and something indescribable. This moment hung in the air, like in slow motion. I didn't know how to respond, but suddenly he leaned even closer and softly kissed me. The kiss was brief, almost accidental, but filled with hidden passion and a slight uncertainty. It felt like he was trying to gauge how I would react, and my response surprised us both. I didn't pull away. In that moment, I felt a new, unknown feeling overwhelm me, as if it was pulling me into another world, one I hadn't been in for a long time. When his lips left mine, I realized I had been holding my breath. We looked at each other, and there was something in his eyes that both attracted and frightened me. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, stepping back. "That was inappropriate, but I couldn't stop myself." I shook my head silently, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. It was hard to explain my feelings, a mix of confusion, excitement, and fear. It was unexpected and wrong, yet irresistibly alluring at the same time. "It's all right," I finally said, trying to regain control. "Really? It's all right." He smiled, a bit embarrassed, and offered to walk me home. I agreed, not knowing why. Inside me, emotions were bubbling up that I couldn't understand. That brief kiss had unlocked something deeply buried within me, as if I had opened a door to an unexplored world. When we reached my house, he stopped and said, "Thank you for tonight, Sophia." "I'm glad we met." "Me too," I replied, hearing a quiet, barely noticeable tremor in my voice. We said our goodbyes, and I watched him leave, his figure slowly disappearing into the evening light. I entered the house, and closing the door behind me, felt a wave of emotions wash over me. That kiss, his words, his gaze, all of it was so unexpected and frightening. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, I felt alive. Several days had passed since that evening at the club, but I couldn't stop thinking about that brief kiss with Daniel. The memory of it was so vivid and alive that I found myself constantly thinking about him, about his gentle smile, his warm words, and the way he had looked at me as if I was the only person in the room. I felt something inside me had changed, like a small flame had ignited in the darkness of my heart, but I still didn't know what to do with it. I tried to focus on my usual tasks, cooking, cleaning, running errands, but every moment I was alone, my thoughts would return to that moment when his lips touched mine. It was as if that kiss had awakened something that had long been buried beneath the routine of everyday life, and the more I thought about it, the stronger my desire became to see him again. One evening, Daniel called me. His voice was calm, but I sensed an underlying hint of excitement. "Sophia, hi," he began, a bit hesitantly. "I've been thinking about you and I'd like to see you again, if, of course, you don't mind." "Of course," I replied, surprised at how easily and quickly I agreed. "Where and when?" "I have a place I'd like to show you," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "An old lighthouse on the coast near Avalon Beach, about an hour from here. The sunsets there are incredible." I felt my heartbeat quicken. A lighthouse sounded like something romantic and almost unreal. I didn't know what to expect, but something in his invitation drew me in. "That sounds wonderful," I said. "Let's meet there." We arranged to meet, and I felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. I chose a simple dress that I loved for its lightness and freedom, trying not to think about the fact that this was a special meeting. When I arrived at the lighthouse, Daniel was already waiting at its base, leaning against the railing. He looked relaxed, but there was a certain tension in his eyes, as if he was anticipating something important. "You came," he said with a slight note of relief in his voice. "It's good to see you." "I'm glad to see you too," I replied, smiling. We began to climb the narrow stone steps leading to the top of the lighthouse. As we walked, Daniel told me about his life, about how this lighthouse had become a symbol of reflection and inspiration for him. He shared how he often came here when he needed to clear his mind and find a sense of peace away from the city. When we reached the top, I saw a stunning view of the Atlantic Ocean before me. The sun was slowly setting over the horizon, painting the sky in bright oranges and purples. The wind blew through my hair and I felt something inside me come alive. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Daniel asked quietly, coming closer. His voice was almost a whisper, but I heard every word. "Yes, very," I replied, looking at the horizon. "There's something special about this place." He turned to me and I saw that his eyes were glowing with warmth and something else I couldn't quite identify. He took a step forward and gently took my hand. "Sophia," he said softly, "I've been thinking about what you said that night, about life passing by, and I realized it's not just about you. It's about me too." I remained silent, feeling his words resonate in my heart. At that moment, I understood that this man truly saw me for who I was, without any pretense or masks. "Do you know what's interesting?" he continued, taking another step closer so that I could feel his breath. "Sometimes we live without noticing the most important moments. We let them slip through our fingers." I felt my heart race again. His words rang true. I felt like life was indeed slipping away from me, and this man in front of me was the one who could see that. He leaned in closer, his face so near that I could feel the warmth of his skin. "Sometimes we just need to take a step forward," he whispered, just before his lips gently touched mine. This kiss was different, deeper, filled with emotions and feeling as if he was pouring his entire soul into it. I responded, feeling warmth blossom in my chest, like a flower opening to the sun. We stood there at the top of the lighthouse, bathed in the light of the setting sun, and the world around us disappeared. This kiss was genuine, sincere, as if he was trying to convey all the things that words could not express. When we pulled away, I felt my head spinning with a mix of emotions. It was so wrong and so beautiful at the same time. I knew this moment would change everything. I could no longer deny my feelings. "I don't know what this means," I said, breathing heavily, "but I feel like I can't pretend anymore." Daniel looked at me with understanding, his eyes reflecting the same inner struggle. "And you don't have to," he replied softly. "Life is too short to waste on pretense." We stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the sounds of the wind and the waves, and I realized that my life was beginning to change. I didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time in a long while, I felt alive and real. After that evening at the lighthouse, I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel, his words, his touch, his kiss. It all kept me awake at night. It felt so real and genuine that I sensed a part of me reaching out to him with newfound strength. But something inside me resisted. I was still married to Jacob, a man with whom I had spent 12 years of my life, a man who had once meant everything to me. Jacob began to notice my growing distance. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, he took my hand and said, "Sophia, I know something's been bothering you. You've been distant lately, and I want to help, but I don't know how." My heart ached hearing the worry in his voice. I looked into his eyes and saw the man I had fallen in love with so many years ago, the man who had stood by me through all the ups and downs of our life together. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how much I cared for Daniel, I couldn't bear to hurt Jacob. But the truth was, I was already hurting him by keeping my feelings hidden. "It's not you, Jacob," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's me. I feel like I've lost myself, and I don't know how to find my way back." He squeezed my hand, his eyes filled with concern. "Sophia, whatever it is, we'll get through it together. You don't have to go through this alone." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I felt a surge of guilt wash over me. I had been so consumed with my own confusion that I had pushed away the one person who had always been there for me. "Thank you," I managed to say, squeezing his hand in return. "I just need some time to figure things out." "Take all the time you need," he said softly, and we finished dinner in silence, both lost in our thoughts. The next day, I decided to take a walk in Fairmount Park to clear my mind. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves crunched under my feet as I made my way along the winding paths. I had no destination in mind. I just needed to escape the suffocating feeling that had settled in my chest. As I sat on a bench, watching the golden leaves fall around me, I thought about my life, my choices, and the woman I had become. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to be honest about my feelings. I loved Jacob. He was my husband, my partner, my friend. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten how to love myself. I had let my dreams and desires fade into the background, and in doing so, I had lost a part of who I was. It was then that I knew what I needed to do. I needed to rediscover who I was, independent of my roles as a wife, a friend, and a lover. I needed to find the courage to stand on my own 2 feet and reclaim the life I wanted to live. That evening, I called Daniel and told him I couldn't see him anymore, not until I had found myself again. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he simply said, "I understand, Sophia. I'll be here if you ever need me." It wasn't the answer I wanted to hear, but it was the one I needed. And as I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was finally taking control of my own life. I walked into the living room, where Jacob was sitting, reading a book. He looked up as I entered, and I sat down beside him, taking his hand in mine. "Jacob," I said, my voice steady, "there's something I need to tell you." He closed his book, giving me his full attention, and I took a deep breath, ready to begin the next chapter of my life, one where I would be true to myself and to the man who had always stood by me, even when I had lost my way. In the days that followed, I felt a sense of clarity that I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't as if everything was suddenly perfect. Far from it. But I felt lighter, as if a weight I had been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. Jacob and I began to reconnect in small but meaningful ways. We took walks together, had long conversations over dinner, and shared the little details of our day that we had once taken for granted. But the memories of Daniel still lingered. There were moments when I would catch myself thinking about him, wondering what he was doing, if he missed me, It was hard to let go completely, and I knew that part of me would always carry a piece of him with me. Yet, I also knew that I had made the right choice, for myself, for my marriage, and for my future. One evening, as Jacob and I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he turned to me and said, "Sophia, I've been thinking. How about we take a trip together? Just the two of us. Somewhere we've never been before." I looked at him, surprised by the suggestion. It had been years since we had taken a vacation together just for ourselves. "Where would we go?" I asked, feeling a spark of excitement. "Anywhere you want," he replied, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Paris, Rome, New York, you name it." I laughed, feeling a warmth spread through me. "I'd love that," I said. "I really would." And for the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely hopeful about our future. We began planning our trip, dreaming about all the places we would explore, the adventures we would have. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to rediscover not just our love for each other, but also our love for life. As the weeks passed, I threw myself into preparing for our journey. I booked flights, researched hotels, and made a list of all the sights we wanted to see. It was exciting, and I felt like a young girl again, filled with anticipation and wonder. But just as I thought I had finally put the past behind me, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Daniel. My heart skipped a beat as I tore open the envelope, my hands trembling slightly. The letter was brief, but his words were as powerful as ever. "Sophia," it read, "I want you to know that I meant every word I said to you. I understand why you made the choice you did, and I respect it. But if you ever find yourself searching for something more, I'll be waiting. Always. Daniel." Tears welled up in my eyes as I read his words, and for a moment I felt a pang of longing, a yearning for what might have been. But as I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, I knew that my path was set. I had made my decision, and there was no turning back. That night, as I lay in bed beside Jacob, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for him, for our life together, and for the strength it had taken to find my way back to myself. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, that there would be challenges and moments of doubt. But I also knew that I was ready to face whatever came my way, with Jacob by my side. And as I closed my eyes, I whispered a silent goodbye to Daniel, thanking him for helping me find the courage to take that first step toward a life that was truly my own. The next morning, as the sun rose and filled our room with light, I reached for Jacob's hand and held it tightly. "I'm ready," I said, and he looked at me with a smile that was both familiar and new, as if seeing me for the first time. "Me too," he replied, and together we faced the dawn of a new day. Thanks for watching. The next story is ready and just as thrilling. Subscribe to catch new stories every day.